so next page, we have language experiences. So in terms of language, I have officially learned 5. Let's see, Miran says, a language journey is a journey that never ends. Yes, I agree. So language journeys, once you commit yourself to become a language student, you're a language student for life. That's how I feel when I learned all 5 of my languages. So I feel like I'm totally out of practice with majority of them, and I would love to come back. It's just I just don't have the time, or I didn't have the time for the past 5 years. So I feel really sad that I'm very lacking when it comes to finding the right words when I'm speaking in a different language. And it takes some time. Like, it takes a long time for me to remember how to translate words into that language. So my processing is very slow at the moment. So if I come back to learning these 5 languages, I feel like my ability to process the words and say them will come back eventually. So at the moment, my first language is Tagalog, which is the national language in the Philippines. Then I mentioned before that I was a former ESL student, so English became my second language. But English is now my dominant language. So I have to emphasize the word dominant because it means that this is the language that you feel the most comfortable in expressing yourself and in communication. So unfortunately, Tagalog has taken a back seat for me, but English has become my dominant language. I feel like I'm able to express myself really well in English, more than Tagalog, and unfortunately my Tagalog's grammar is not the best in speech and writing. So there's that. The next language I learned was Spanish, and I took Spanish for 4 years when I was in middle school up to high school. And the reason why I committed to taking 4 years of Spanish is because my school promised me that if I learned Spanish or French for 4 years, I would be awarded the seal of biliteracy. And during middle school, it was quite new. I would say they were still quite new with language learning at the time. They used to be so proactive of, oh, don't talk in another language but English, because if you learn another language, you'll get confused. So they had a very homogenous view of the English language, and they strongly discouraged students, especially 1.5 generation students like myself and my sister, from remembering or retaining our language. So it's still quite unclear so I'm gonna go off tangent a little bit, but it's a little bit unclear in terms of child language development. I can't remember, but something about children, they can make a decision whether they can retain the language that they grew up in or they can reject it. Oh, so Miran says, can you mix all the languages you learn? I can't even handle 3 languages. The brain mixes all the languages I learn, creating another language. Just a joke. Yes, it happens to me actually. So it's just like you said, Miran, because I remember you learned, Japanese, Korean, and English. I have the same moment. So when I want to speak, for example, Bahasa Indonesian, I end up speaking in Spanish. And if I want to speak in French, I speak in Spanish. And when I speak in Spanish, it's Tagalog or Bahasa Indonesian. So it's just like, it's just a hodgepodge of like, it's a mess. It's a hot pot mess of like trying to retain all of these languages that I learned while growing up. So it's really hard for me to retain what I learned in my current position, but I'm hoping to go back and relearn them. So just to refresh my memory, the first 2 that I do want to return to are French and Tagalog, because after I graduate, my goal is to celebrate my graduation by going to France. So that's why I'm very motivated to relearn French. The only thing that frustrates me about the French language is the R sound that they have. It's a very throaty R. So it's like, it sounds like you're pronouncing H, but it's coming from the throat, like you're gargling. So it's like, I'm overdoing it. I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly like the French, but it's somewhere there. So it's just like very throaty R. So like when you say the word red in French, I'm gonna say it with the American accent. You say rouge. That's the American pronunciation. But in French, it's rouge. Back to my list here. So again, I've learned 5 languages, all of which I suffer a lot because I haven't practiced it in a long time. But I have all of the materials. I still have all of my Spanish notes from middle school and high school. So all I have to do is just review everything I wrote and then rewrite everything, and also use my textbooks and papers. And then if I do that, then I'll remember. French, I also have my books and my papers for it. So I'm an elementary learner for French. Bahasa Indonesian, I learned this from friends and my former partner. So I would say I have a friend who I still ask questions about Bahasa Indonesian. And what's so interesting about my experience with the Bahasa Indonesian language is that it's a trigger language for me. So what I mean by trigger is that the moment I am in a situation where I am immersed in the language, so let's say I go back to Indonesia, right? And I remember the trigger for me to remember everything I learned in Bahasa Indonesian, despite the 1 year or I think it was maybe 6 months apart. The time when I left Indonesia and the time I came back, I think it has been 6 months. And no. It was a year. Yeah, there was a year gap from the time I came back from Indonesia. So I came back home in 2018. Then I went back in 2019. And I forgot Bahasa Indonesia when I landed in Indonesia at the time. And then I was trying so hard to remember everything I learned. Like, how do I say, where do I go here? How do I go upstairs? Is it downstairs? Etc. Like, I knew the words because I used them when I first arrived. But the second time I came back, I just couldn't remember it. And it was frustrating. And then I remember the moment someone bumped into me, that was the moment everything came back. I still remember it, even as I think about it. It's so vivid in my thoughts. And I can say it right away right now, too. So the word to say excuse me in Indonesian is permisi. So the moment I said permisi, everything I learned about Indonesian just came back in that moment. And I was in Indonesia for at least 1 week, I think. And that's when everything flooded back. And it's so interesting that it only took someone to bump into me to remember everything. So yeah, triggers are awesome, I would say, in terms of language. Triggers for mental health is not good, but triggers for language learning is awesome. Next is I am planning to learn Korean and Japanese. Well, not planning. I am in the motions of learning them. I learned Korean for a short time from my lovely friend Miran. I haven't had the opportunity to learn because life just got so busy, and unfortunately I had to put that in the back burner. Japanese has been very passive for me. I've been watching lots of anime. I've been watching a Japanese vlog of a day in a life, I believe. And I try not to read the closed captions. So I try to go based on what words and expressions I'm familiar with and what can I associate them in English. And it has been working for me because a lot of the times when I hear a certain word and I see the subtitle, I notice that the subtitle doesn't give it enough justice, right? So we'll talk more about inaccuracies with subtitling and also loss of translation, which is the big topic on that. So it's really interesting how subtitles and the way people translate expressions, when you've come to recognize what these words actually mean based on shows and different situations, it's just really cool just to see how much I've grown passively when it comes to Japanese. And then finally, the last language I want to learn is, well, not last, it's probably the last at the considering that this is a language I'm thinking of right now. In the future, I might learn more, but the language I want to learn after Korean and Japanese is Italian. So it would be really cool if I learned Italian.